And we are live. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator for Village Books and Paper Dreams in Bellingham, Washington. Before we begin, if this is your first event on Crowdcast, if you're experiencing an echo, you may try putting some headphones in. In fact, I am hearing a little bit of feedback. I don't know if you gentlemen are hearing it. Okay. Let's see. We may need Stephen to plug in some headphones. I'm not sure yet. I'm actually going to go ahead and mute Stephen right now just to see if that takes care of it. Yes. Okay. So that's the Crowdcast echo. Usually a pair of headphones takes care of that. So hopefully we won't hear that again. We do see all these lovely comments in the chat. Thank you, all of you who have been chiming in and saying how excited you are for this event. We have been so excited for this event. There are several hundred people who are watching tonight, and we're so very pleased. So thank you all for joining us. I want to let you know that I am going to disable the chat. I'm just going to do that until it's time for the Q&A. So I will be doing that right now. I promise we're going to bring you back later. But for right now, we're just going to focus on the presentation. So you will have a chance to ask questions. And specifically, I want to let you know how you can do that. During the presentation, you're probably going to come up with some questions that you think you'd like to ask our author this evening. So if you look in the center of the screen at the bottom, it says ask a question. There's even a little number 3 next to that because there are already some questions there. If you click on ask a question, a little dialog box pops up. You can type in your question that you have, and we're going to collect those there. And they'll be waiting for us when it's time for the Q&A portion. I do ask you to please make sure that if you are going to ask questions when we get to the Q&A, please do use that ask a question feature. It's a lot easier for our moderator rather than having the questions have a tendency to cycle up the chat when we bring it back. So if you could pop your questions and ask a question, we would appreciate it. I do want to state that the Village Books Virtual Readings Gallery is a safe space. Any user exhibiting offensive or inappropriate behavior will be dismissed from the event immediately. Okay, and then center screen right below me, it says purchase books here. That is a direct link to the Village Books website where you can purchase copies of What It's Like to Be a Bird, this beautiful book right here that we are celebrating this evening. It's so gorgeous. So we have a whole variety of David Allen Sibley's books there at that same page. If you click on that link, it takes you right to Village Books and you can purchase his books. And now, really quickly, I need to say some thank yous because there are a lot of people for us to thank this evening. First, I want to thank our co-sponsors this evening because I'm fairly certain that it's largely because of them that we have such a huge crowd tonight. The first thank you goes out to the organizers of Whatcom Reads. This is one of those programs that really spotlights the strong readership and sense of community that we have here in Whatcom County. And the series this year featuring Washington Black by Essie Adujian has been phenomenal. The organizers of this program have just knocked it out of the park. So thank you so much, Whatcom Reads, for everything that you do to keep Whatcom County reading. The second group to thank is the North Cascades Audubon Society, whose mission is to promote the study and conservation of birds and other wildlife, their habitat, and the environment, to increase public appreciation of the values of wildlife, plants, and the natural environment, and to stimulate action to protect and preserve them for the future. So the work that they do for the birding community is invaluable. So thank you to the North Cascades Audubon Society. And last but certainly not least, I wish to thank those of you who made a financial contribution at registration in support of our event programming at Village Books. To say we're in a challenging time is, of course, an understatement, and we are overwhelmed by your generosity. Your contributions are a big help in enabling us to maintain our robust event programming that people are used to, and we are very grateful. And to show our gratitude, I am delighted to announce that Village Books will be donating a percentage of all of the contributions made for this event to both Whatcom Reads and the North Cascades Audubon Society. So if you're feeling inspired this evening, it's not too late. We did add a donate button right there on the bottom of the screen. So if you feel like you want to help to support the 3 organizations that help put this event together tonight, number 1, absolutely, please consider buying a book. And then, of course, you can also make a donation, and we thank you. All right, so let's get to the fun part. And now for our moderator. Stephen Harper has been interested in birds since he was in the 4th grade, when his teacher had the students all join Junior Audubon. He especially loves listening to the birds and is currently the president of North Cascades Audubon Society. He's here to introduce our special guest and to moderate the Q&A period. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Harper.
Well, thank you and welcome, everybody.
Oh, Stephen, do you happen to have any headphones?
I don't have any headphones. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I turned my speakers off. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, 7 years ago, I had the distinct pleasure of going on a bird walk with David Sibley and then attending David's talk at Village Books. He was introducing his recently published 2nd edition of the Sibley Guide to the Birds. I had already regarded David's field guides to be the successors to Roger Tory Peterson's field guides and had looked forward to this 2nd edition. I have continued to rely on the 2nd edition of the guide, as well as the Sibley birding app while birding. But David is not only an illustrator of birds. He has also been an avid observer of his birds since he was 7 years old. Drawing on these observations, he previously contributed illustrations and information in the Sibley Guide to Bird Life and Behavior. And now in his latest book, What's It Like to Be a Bird?, David makes it even more enjoyable to learn about bird behavior, and at the same time, enjoy David's amazing illustrations. It is a thrill to have David back with us tonight. So please welcome David Allen Sibley.
Hi. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Village Books and all the co-sponsors of this event. It's a pleasure to be there. Well, to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I really enjoyed my previous trips to Bellingham, and hopefully I'll be able to do it again. But I'm tonight sitting at home in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and I saw in the comments there's a mention of Deerfield, but that Deerfield Academy is about 1.5 miles away from where I'm sitting right now. So coming to you live from Massachusetts, and the pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out. And so I have a slideshow, and I'm going to talk for half an hour-ish about my new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird. So this book, it started out probably 15 years ago. I started thinking about an idea for a bird book for children, a kid's guide to birds, and thinking about some of the things that I would put into such a book. And besides just introducing the birds and how to identify them, I really wanted the book to be visually engaging, and thinking back to the things that I really enjoyed as, say, a 10-year-old looking at bird books, was birds in action, birds doing things and really exciting, dramatic poses. So images like this, Western kingbird attacking a red-tailed hawk in flight, is the idea for that, the inspiration for that was trying to channel my 10-year-old self and remember what kinds of illustrations really caught my attention at that age. So, but as I worked on the book more, it drifted away from being an identification guide and more into just a book about answering all the questions that I heard about birds. And the more research I did on that, the more interesting all of that became. So eventually it turned into the book that it is now, a collection of essays, collection of short 1-paragraph, 2-paragraph essays about all the most fascinating, amazing things about birds. And so much of it was new for me as I did the research for this book. Next slide. Claire, there we go. So some of the, I kept lists of questions that I would try to answer. And one of the questions, this was pretty self-explanatory, is a roadrunner really that much faster than a coyote, the way the cartoon shows? And this is the answer in an illustration. So if there was a 100-yard dash involving an ostrich, a coyote, Usain Bolt, a roadrunner, and an average human, they would come in, cross the finish line in that order. So the coyote really didn't need all those rockets and other accelerants to catch up to the roadrunner. Next slide. So among the things that I learned as I worked on this book, one of the first surprising things was this bit of research that I ran across, that ground nesting birds like this killdeer, they lay their eggs directly on the ground, on just a shallow depression in bare gravel. And the eggs are camouflaged. They blend in with the background. They're very difficult to spot. And the bird has this cryptic coloration, a sort of disruptive pattern that helps it hide. It breaks up the outline of the bird, so it's hard to spot when it's sitting on the ground incubating its eggs. But that's all visual camouflage, and I had never really thought about what happens at night when foxes and skunks and raccoons are hunting, and hunting by smell. So it turns out that the oil that birds preen into their feathers to keep the feathers in good condition, during the nesting season, these ground nesting birds, the chemical composition of that oil changes to something that is odorless, undetectable by mammals. So birds like killdeer, mallard, all these ground nesting birds, they're camouflaged by smell while they're incubating. So presumably something like a fox could walk by just a few feet away and not even know the killdeer is there at night. And like so many other things, this amazing bit of information really, it ends up just bringing up more questions. And there's so many unanswered questions about birds, even really familiar common birds. I tried to highlight some of that in the book, but in this case, one of the questions is, odorless preen oil seems like a really good idea. Why don't the birds use that year-round? And as far as I know, nobody's done any research on that. The answer is still waiting to be discovered. And so many other questions like that are still unknown about very common birds. Next slide. So when I was a kid, I really liked drawing birds, and my other favorite subject to draw was dinosaurs. And now we know that those are pretty much the same thing, that birds are the living descendants of dinosaurs. This is a feathered dinosaur called Ankylosaurus that lived about 150 million years ago. And there were a lot of feathered dinosaurs at that time, as new fossil discoveries have shown. And feathers were pretty well evolved, and there were already some birds appearing. This is when Archaeopteryx, the first sort of bird-like fossil that's so famous, was found around this time. But about a little less than 100 million years after this, when a lot more birds had evolved, but then there was an apocalyptic event when an asteroid struck the Earth in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula about 65 million years ago. And that was such an incredible event. It wiped out about 75% of all the species on Earth. The descriptions of what actually happened during that event are just mind-boggling. But it's thought that only 3 species of small ground-dwelling birds survived that event. All the dinosaurs were wiped out. That was the end of the dinosaurs. And of the many, many species of birds that existed at that time, only 3 survived. and gave rise in the 65 million years since then, gave rise to all 10,000 plus species of birds on Earth. Next slide. So the evolution of feathers, as I said, lots of those dinosaurs had feathers, even 150 million years ago. Feathers really define birds. All birds have feathers and nothing else has feathers. So the sense of how feathers evolved, the thinking is that it followed a path like this. From the left side of this image, it started as just a hollow bristle. And that would have offered some insulation and also could be colored for camouflage or for display. The next stage, the fibers that make up the bristle separate into loose strands and form a kind of fuzz like down, which would have been even better for insulation and start to maybe provide a little bit of water repellency. The next stage, the feather branches in the middle of this image. So there's a central shaft with a branching pattern, the real feathery shape. But it's the next stage where another level of branching occurs. So there's a central shaft, the side branches called barbs, and off of each of those barbs, another set of little tiny branches that are hooked called barbules, and those grab onto the hooks on the adjacent barb and hold them together. And it's those barbules, that extra level of branching that holds the feather together to create a more solid surface. And that leads to all kinds of other adaptations. That helps make the feathers waterproof. That allows for the final stage in the evolution of feathers, which is the feather on the far right, one of the really highly modified flight feathers of a modern bird. So this is an outer wing feather, and it's asymmetrical, and asymmetrical in many ways. The angle of the barbs is different on each side of the shaft. The shape of the barbs is different. The shape of the shaft changes through its length to different, from round at the base to square, sort of rectangular, trapezoidal. At each point along its length, this feather has different properties of stiffness and flexes in different directions, all just exquisitely adapted for flight. But that's the last stage. The most highly evolved feathers are the ones that are used in flight. So it sort of answers the question of whether feathers evolved for flight. I think it's clear that feathers initially were all about insulation and coloration, and gradually these other features developed. Next slide. So now we have birds like blue jay. They're just exquisitely colored, and the patterns and the variations. And in this case, there's no blue pigment in birds at all. All the blue color that we see in birds is produced by the structure of the surface of the feather and how that interacts with light waves. Certain wavelengths bounce off of these structures and are enhanced, and other wavelengths are canceled out and flattened out, and we don't see them. Next slide. And we have really, really extraordinary coloration and feather modifications, like the male wood duck. These feathers, some are longer to form the crest. Feathers have different textures, different sheens. Some are shiny, glossy. And just amazing variation and radiation of differences in feathers. Next slide. Next slide, please. And the egrets, of course, the birds that were hunted for their feathers 100 years ago, up to 120 years ago. These long, lacy plumes that are just so delicate and so valuable in the fashion world over 120 years ago. Next slide. So I mentioned that one of the things that feathers are good for is waterproofing. There's really important function of feathers to keep the bird dry and insulated. And the feathers are so effective at waterproofing that even a duck can swim in water that's freezing. We would perish within a couple of minutes. But ducks swim around in that all day. And next slide. So this was another myth, another thing that I had heard my whole life and always assumed it made sense that feathers are waterproof because of the oil that the birds preen onto them. But it turns out feathers are waterproof because of their structure. It's the spacing of the barbs on the feathers that keeps water from going through. So this is a feather on the left and then a cross section of a few of the barbs and the little barbules that stick out between the barbs and hook on to hold them together, and a little drop of water suspended on top of the barbs. And so the way the barbs work, the surface tension holds the drop of water together and limits how much it can bend. So it is suspended on the ridges of just a few barbs. It's making contact with such a small part of the feather that it will just roll off. The spaces between the barbs are too small for the drop of water to go through. And because it's only making contact with such a small part of the feather, it doesn't stick. It just rolls off. And this is another important function of the barbules that hold the barbs together, those little hooks. They're important for holding the barbs together so that they form a more solid surface like this. But at the same time, they keep the barbs from being pulled closer together. They maintain the spacing between the barbs at just the right distance to keep water from either going through or from sticking to the surface of the feather. And that is primarily what makes feathers waterproof. The oil probably helps conditioning the feathers and making them a little less sticky or a little less likely that water will stick. But it's the structure that really keeps water from going through. Next slide. And we know that feathers are essential for flight, but feathers are really just the beginning of what makes flight possible in birds, or maybe the end of what makes flight possible in birds. Birds have it's always said that birds have a very lightweight skeleton. It turns out that the skeleton of a bird, like this barn swallow, weighs about the same percentage of its body weight as the skeleton of a mammal of the same size. So birds don't actually have a lighter skeleton, but they have hollow bones. The bone tissue that makes up their bones is denser. So between the denser tissue and the hollow bones, they can have bones that are stronger, that are longer and stronger and stiffer than the bones of a mammal. Without adding any weight. So birds don't actually have a lighter skeleton. They have a longer and stiffer, a more elongated, extended, and stiffer skeleton than mammals without any extra weight. And that's one of the things that makes flight possible. Next slide. Another really critical factor in making flight possible and making it efficient is that a lot of the adaptations that we see in birds are geared towards making the weight, the main bulk of the bird concentrated in a small central compact mass suspended below the wings. So this is the body of a pheasant in reddish, sort of the flesh and bones of the pheasant in the reddish color, and in light gray, the outline of the body, or the feathers, the wings, the tail, the streamlining of the feathers. So you can see that the tail is entirely feathers. The wings are almost entirely feathers. They're just slender bones and mostly tendons that extend out into the wings. The big muscles that power flight are incorporated into that central body mass, and even more, they're on the underside of the body. It's the breast muscles that power flight. Both the upstroke and the downstroke of the wings is powered by the breast muscles. So all that weight, the heaviest parts of the bird, are concentrated, balanced right under the wings. And even this is one reason that birds don't have teeth. They have, instead of teeth, a lightweight bill that they use for handling food, but then they swallow their food. And most birds, all birds, swallow their food more or less whole. And once it's in their stomach, which again is balanced underneath the wings, once the food is in their stomach, then it gets processed. So the powerful stomach muscles squeeze and grind, and the birds swallow grit like sand and gravel. And as the stomach squeezes and massages, that's essentially chewing. That's where chewing happens for a bird, is in their stomach. But it means that they can fly into the bird feeder, grab a bunch of seeds, swallow them, and immediately fly away, still perfectly balanced. So if, even if we had wings like birds, and we're so heavy we would need very large wings, we still would be very ungainly and inefficient in flight, because our bodies are so rangy and decentralized. The bird's body is all gathered, compacted into this small central body mass, and the extremities are extremely lightweight. Next slide. So we have birds like Peregrine Falcon that is just so perfectly adapted for flight. Everything about it, the streamlining of the feathers, the stiffness of the feathers, the shape, all adapted for high-speed flight. And the highest airspeed that's been more or less accepted for Peregrine Falcon is about 240 miles per hour. But there's a theoretical calculation that they could go over 300 miles per hour, and it's very possible that they do. It's just been extremely difficult to measure, but the fastest animal on Earth. Next slide. So another thing that makes flight possible, and this is a bit of the bird's dinosaur ancestry. This is a diagram, a very simplified schematic diagram of a bird's respiratory system. And there's a little more explanation in the book, so I guess it's a little complicated to explain. But what happens is, in a bird's lungs, in the purplish section in the middle of this image, their lungs are rigid. They don't expand and contract the way ours do. Birds have air sacs that expand and contract to control airflow. Air flows through their lungs in one direction, from back to front, and the lungs don't change shape. The air flows through sort of the way coolant flows through a car radiator, and oxygen is extracted, and carbon dioxide is released into their breath, and but the way the air sacs work, fresh air full of oxygen is flowing through the lungs on both inhale and exhale. So as they breathe in, the air sacs expand, it pulls air in from the outside, and it's pulling air forward through the lungs to fill the front air sac. When they breathe out, the air sacs are squeezed down, and fresh air that has just entered into the rear air sac is then forced forward through the lungs. So on both inhale and exhale, they're getting fresh air through their lungs. And one thing this means is that it's safe to say you have never seen a bird that's out of breath. If you've seen a bird that's panting, it's because it's too hot, and they do overheat. They have a very high metabolism, high body temperature, and really good insulation. So they do get too hot. And they have to pant to cool off, but they don't have any trouble with getting enough oxygen. And it's thought that this respiratory system evolved hundreds of millions of years ago in dinosaurs, when there was actually only half as much oxygen in the atmosphere as there is now. So it's a dinosaur respiratory system evolved for to be much more efficient with oxygen. And now birds reap the benefits. So they can fly continuously for hours and never get out of breath. Next slide. So another aspect of birds that I found really fascinating and is their vision. And it's so well, we celebrate a lot of birds for their vision. There's eagle-eyed, which I'll get to in a minute, but birds have incredible vision, and different species have evolved very, very different systems of vision, different strategies. So this snipe, it's looking straight at us, but not really. Its eyes are on the sides of its head. So what it's seeing is 360 degrees around it. It sees its entire surroundings, 360 degrees, front, back, left, right, all the time. And it can also see 180 degrees overhead. The entire sky and the entire horizon is visible to a snipe at all times. And where we see detail in one point in our vision, one tiny point, both eyes focus on the same spot, and there's just one very small point of detail, and the rest is peripheral vision. For the snipe, it's seeing its entire surroundings, and the snipe sees detail in a horizontal band along the horizon. So it's seeing some detail out to the sides horizontally, mostly to the sides, not so much front and back, but it can't see the tip of its bill, and it doesn't see very well straight ahead. It doesn't see particularly well straight ahead. It's seeing, its best vision is, excuse me, best vision is to the sides. So this is a bird that's finding food almost entirely by the sense of touch. They have a very sensitive feel in the tip of their bill. They can also taste with the tip of their bill, and they have a good sense of smell. So they're using that to find food, and their eyes are watching for danger. And a snipe, a bird like that, relies on camouflage for protection. So if it senses danger, if it sees something alarming, a snipe will just freeze and crouch and hold perfectly still and rely on its cryptic coloration to hide it, to protect it. And what this visual system allows them to do is to freeze and still keep track of everything that's going on around them without moving. So their vision is almost entirely directed towards watching for danger. Next slide. Now here's the eagle, and eagles have very sharp vision. They have about 5 times as many as dense concentration of rods and cones as we do. So they're seeing essentially 5 times higher resolution. Imagine looking through 5-power binoculars, and they can see details, incredible detail at a distance. And that's been well known for a long time. And they also have, so the cone cells in the eyes see color. Rods are for dark light perception. We have I think only 5% cones in our eyes that that perceive color. So our color vision is really not very good. We're seeing mainly dark and light. And in eagles, 80% of the light sensing cells in their eyes are cones. They're seeing, they're seeing 5 times more detail, and then something like 16 times more color than we do. And we just have no concept of what that means. They, like a lot of birds, can also see ultraviolet light, a whole range of wavelengths that we can't see. And where we see one point of detail and both eyes focus on the same spot, in an eagle, the eyes, again, they're on the sides of the head, a little more forward than the snipe, but they're facing in different directions, and each eye has 2 sensitive points of detail. So an eagle is essentially seeing 4 different points of detail at all times. Again, they don't see the tip of their bill very well. They don't see in front of them very well. They see off to the side. So the eagle portrait on the left here is looking straight at you. It is focusing all of its attention with one eye. It is looking at, trying to see as much detail as it can. So focusing one of those points of detail on you. That is how a bird gives you its full attention. A bird like an eagle. And this is what's going on with robins. It's a common misconception that robins are listening for worms. They hop around on the lawn and they tilt their head to the side as if they're listening. They're actually looking. They're tilting their head to aim the point of detail in one eye at the ground, to watch for activity, to watch for signs of worms or insects, and then they'll lunge forward and try to catch something. But that is when a bird like a robin or an eagle wants to give you its full attention, it will turn its head to the side like this. Next slide. Another visual ability of birds that I was surprised to learn about as I researched this book is that they process visual information much more quickly than we do, twice as fast, more than twice as fast in some species. So when we watch a movie, a video, it relies on the fact that we can't process visual images more quickly than about 25 images per second. So movies, videos, they run at 27 frames per second, 30 frames per second, things like that. It's a little bit faster than we can process, and the images blur together. So we see a moving picture. Birds like this black phoebe, these flycatchers that catch insects in midair, they're processing visual information more than twice as fast. 70 images per second has been documented, and presumably if they watched one of our movies, they would see a slideshow, just a series of still images flashing across the screen, which is what's actually happening, but we can't detect it. But they can. And if you think about this, it's another critical adaptation for flight, especially the kinds of flight that these birds do. A phoebe can track the movement of a mosquito in midair and catch that insect in flight, in midair. And the high-speed video has shown that they're not just flying through it and scooping it up in their mouth. They're actually snapping it in the tip of their bill. So flying up to a mosquito, a gnat in midair, and snapping it out of the air with the tips of their mandibles. And imagine flying through the air and grabbing a mosquito with tweezers. That's essentially what the flycatchers are doing, and it all relies on this ability to track fast movement and keep track of that kind of movement. Next slide. So this is you watch birds like hummingbirds, these rufous hummingbirds, they're always battling at the feeders or at flower beds, diving, chasing each other, just weaving between the flowers at high speed, and just incredible to watch. But for them, they're able to track the passing of all these obstacles. So we talk about the blur of fence posts along the highway. To a bird, they're able to track the movement of each of those obstacles as it approaches and passes by. So the hummingbirds that are dodging and weaving and diving around through the flower bed and through twigs and chasing each other are just operating on an entirely different level. Next slide. Well, that is a taste of some of the things that are in my new book, and it was really fascinating for me to research it, to learn about all of these things. And like I said, so many more questions. There's so much more. There's so much that I didn't put in the book, that I didn't have the space or the time to put in, and also so many unanswered questions. And so what I've talked about here is mostly the physical adaptations, the feathers, the senses, the structure. But there's so many interesting social, behavioral adaptations. So the intelligence of birds is much greater than we would have imagined. And these ravens have an incredible social, complex social life, social structure. So anyway, it's just so fascinating. I find birds more fascinating all the time, the more I learn about them. And I hope that this book will help to introduce you to some of the more amazing things that birds do, and give you some new perspective and new insights, and increase your own enjoyment of watching birds. So thanks for your attention, and I think we'll turn it over to some questions now.
Hi, David. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. That's better.
Am I creating feedback for you?
No, you sound fine.
I put on some headphones here. Okay, I've got quite a few questions, so we'll just start right off here. And my first question is, this latest book seems to approach learning about bird behavior in a very different fashion than many bird behavior books. Instead of comprehensively describing bird behavior, you offer these short essays that are really easy to grasp and did you plan this to fit our seemingly shorter attention span these days, or how did you decide to organize this way or approach it this way?
Yeah, some of it goes back to the origin of this book as an idea for a kid's book. So the idea of easily understandable, digestible little bits of information. But I also I guess I didn't consciously think about this, but I understood it, and now I've kind of put it into words just recently, that I think it's much easier to retain information, to learn something if it's related directly to a story or an individual. So introducing something like the hummingbirds, or the phoebe, introducing that bird that's a familiar bird for a lot of people, and then talking about their vision and how they catch those insects. I think that's a much more effective way of teaching than having a long chapter about bird vision and mentioning examples along the way, but starting with the phoebe and saying, here's the phoebe, introducing the phoebe, and here's one of their amazing adaptations, their vision. I think that's it's a more direct and more memorable way to take in information.
Yeah, I have a copy of the book, and I love just picking it up and reading through just a few of the pages, instead of, and it doesn't make any difference where I pick it up. I choose another bird and I learn a few things about that bird that I've never known before, and so I think it's a wonderful way to approach it and easily digestible for me.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that, going back to the original question of asking if this is a kind of a nod to the shorter attention span nowadays, I think that part of the sort of the overall concept of how this book is structured is actually a direct spin-off of the sort of hyperlinked world of the internet, that I wouldn't have conceived of a book quite like this 20 years ago, before the internet and the hyperlink. But having that, being familiar, everyone's familiar now with the way the internet, the web works, and that you can be reading one thing and have a link to something else, and it's all just a big network of information. That actually did figure into my planning for the structure of the book. So it's not meant to be read cover to cover. It's meant to be read sort of randomly as a network.
You mentioned at the beginning of this this question that you started out with a concept of a children's book. Do you plan to write a children's book in the future?
People have asked me that question for a long time. It's why I started working on this book. And the reason this book turned out the way it did is because I just couldn't get excited about doing a straight sort of field guide for kids. I don't, and again, this book, I keep hearing from people whose kids, 8 years old, 10 years old, the kids really like this book, and they can handle it. And so I don't, so I guess the answer is no. Currently, I don't have any plans to do anything more directly along the lines of a children's book, but I will keep thinking about that. But I keep getting back to this idea of I can't bring myself to just simplify. I know that when I was that age, that kids are sponges. There's no limit to how much information they can take in. And at that age, I wasn't really interested in a simplified book. I wanted everything. So
yeah, it feels like this is really a book for all ages, and it's certainly adaptable to children too. And so,
yeah, well, thanks.
All right, go ahead. I have another question here. You spent a good part of your life observing birds and their behavior. So how do you recommend other birders approach observing birds to increase their understanding of bird behavior?
I think, I didn't consciously watch bird behavior until fairly recently, or sort of really really think about it. But I think that one of the keys is just watching the birds and really thinking about what they're doing and why. And if you're that engaged in that sort of active observation of really asking questions while you're watching, and you'll very quickly start to notice, this bird interacting with that one. The male does this, and then the female does that, and there must be young nearby. Or you'll notice different vocalizations that are associated with different behaviors. You'll get a sense of whether the bird is nervous or relaxed or aggressive. And I kind of picked up a lot of that just incidentally through hours, many hours in the field. But the more directly I kind of engage and ask those questions and sort of watch some birds and say, "Ooh, I think this might happen next. I think this is what's going on." I'm going to watch and see if those birds are really interacting in that way. So that I think it all comes down to really just watching, time in the field, and really paying attention and asking questions, which of course comes naturally to a lot of us. We just want to be out there, and it's just a sense of wonder and curiosity, sort of what's going to happen next.
It seems like with the COVID situation this year and so many people at home and feeding birds, they're spending a lot of time watching birds, and I know that at Audubon we're getting way more questions about what's going on with these birds, the behavior. And so I think that's giving people an opportunity to really observe birds more and spend some more time with them.
Yeah, I think it's and in being able to watch the same place, like your backyard or a local park or some walking route, and seeing the same birds over and over is really and that's a great way to start to wonder about them. So yeah, I've heard a lot of that this year from in the last year, of people who are really noticing birds for the first time, or noticing a lot of new things about the birds that are in their backyard.
Right. Here's a question, sort of a technical question about your illustrating. We have a listener that wants to know, how large are your original paintings of the birds that you do? What medium do you use? Do you use photos? The favorite paint? And then finally, what is the most frustrating bird or structure for you to draw?
Yes. Okay. Lots of questions. So the original artwork that appears in my books is generally 2 or 3 times larger than the reproductions. I like to paint quite large, and right behind me here you can see a couple of paintings that are extremely large, a painted bunting and a black-throated green warbler that are 3 feet tall, but usually I'm not painting quite that large. But all the paintings in What It's Like to Be a Bird were done about twice as large as they appear in the book. And that allows me to use a fairly large brush, to be fairly loose and relaxed about the brush strokes, and kind of, if I go outside the lines by a millimeter or 2 when I'm painting, it doesn't matter that much. It's not that critical. So at that size, it's a lot easier to control. And then when they're reduced down to the size they appear in the book, they look a lot more detailed, a lot more kind of tight and finished. But the originals are pretty rough. And so for paint, I use I've used mostly gouache, which is opaque watercolor. All of my field guide illustrations in the bird guide were done with gouache. And it works really well for that. I use it fairly dry. It's so it's kind of cross-hatching layers of different colors, different shadings to develop the layers of texture and color of bird feathers. When I illustrated the tree guide about 10 years ago, I switched to acrylic paint for that because gouache doesn't handle green very well. The range of bright greens don't come out very well with gouache. And also the sort of smooth, satiny texture of leaves is very difficult to achieve with gouache. So acrylic made that much easier, and I got familiar with acrylics by doing all that work. So all the paintings in What It's Like to Be a Bird are done with acrylic.
Okay.
Even the more sketch style, where there's a pencil sketch and then just a light wash of color over that. That's in this book. That's all acrylic, using transparent washes, sort of like watercolor, but it's all done with acrylic paint.
How about the most frustrating bird or structure of birds or part of birds?
Yeah, I've always been challenged by drawing birds' feet. And a lot of my friends tease me about that. A lot of the illustrations in the bird guide, if you pay attention, you'll notice they only have 1 foot, which was actually not so much because I didn't like drawing feet, but just because I could simplify the illustration a little bit more, and there didn't seem to be a need to show 2 feet. So, but yes, drawing birds' feet, and in the same way, drawing herons and egrets, there's this kind of contrast of in the herons and egrets, they're incredibly graceful, elegant and graceful looking at a distance, but up close and in detail, that neck is bony and angular and very reptilian, dinosaur looking. So getting that balance of the angular aspects of the neck along with the graceful curve. And birds' feet are kind of the same way. They're very reptilian. I just have always found that challenging to try to represent that in my drawings. I've spent a whole lot more time practicing the rest of the bird and less time practicing drawing feet. But yes, that would be my biggest challenge.
You know, this presentation tonight is part of the Whatcom Reads program that we're doing in our area. And so as a nature illustrator, you have something in common with the protagonist in the book Washington Black. And I believe you read the book Washington Black.
Yes.
So can you speak to your impression of the book, and did anything in there particularly resonate with you?
Yeah, many things. I love the book, and one thing, just the sense of that you that there's really drawing is a passion, that it's for me, drawing is a way of understanding the world, kind of a way of exploring things like birds, and you really don't know something until you've drawn it, and that's not really mentioned. It's not really put forward in the book, but it does play out, that this sense of that the main character Wash really, as he's, there's a scene late in the book when he's working through some challenge, and he sits down and actually draws a picture of what he remembers of the plantation where he grew up. And that sort of sense of using drawing as a way of understanding, of processing, I think is it really rang true to me. And the other thing on a broader note, sort of that the thing that makes his story really extraordinary is that he finds a mentor, or a mentor takes him on, and that's how he escapes from slavery and builds a new life. He has a couple of mentors along the way, people who recognize his drawing talent and encourage him and open up doors for him. And for me, that was, my father's an ornithologist. So when I showed an interest in drawing birds, there were all kinds of opportunities. And I've had so many people who helped me out along the way. And it's really an incredible privilege to have grown up with that. And the story of Washington Black, and the only thing that separated him from a short and brutal life as a slave was his drawing ability, and the fact that the stroke of luck that someone happened along who appreciated that and took him out of there. And I mean, it's that's still a big divide in society, that there's privilege of having access to mentors and the ability to follow a passion like this, and a lot of people who simply can't. And
Right.
So I thought those, the kind of the importance of drawing for understanding the world, and that just the importance of mentors to everyone. It's both of those things really jumped out at me in the book.
Well, thanks. Related to this, there's a proposal by a number of people for the AOS, or the American Ornithological Society Classification Committee, to consider changing the common names of some of the birds in North America to make them totally descriptive, instead of being named for early white colonialists and naturalists.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered what you thought of that. A recent example of that is they decided to change the name of McGowan's longspur to
Mm-hmm.
the thick-billed longspur. And so I wondered what your impression of this proposal is, or your feelings around it. Because you have a lot of field guides. There'd have to be a lot of changes.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's a trivial consideration. The changing names change, and names just a label, a convenient label to help us communicate with each other about what we've seen, and I support that movement, that the idea of changing names to remove, it is the history of the Western world, that everything was white men. The people with privilege were the ones who had the opportunities to explore, to study, to name new species of birds, and a name like McCown, the person named McCown was an officer in the Confederacy in the Civil War, and I think that all happened after he was posted in the West and collected some specimens of this longspur that was new to science, and it was named for him. But as a someone who fought to preserve slavery, it's a very objectionable name. And it's, those of us, again, I can't, I speak from a position of real privilege, and to me, it's just a name, and that's the way things were. But it's I can put myself in that, imagining if the name was the name of someone who had really oppressed my family, if it was, something like Hitler's Longspur, we wouldn't stand for that. That name would be changed, and it's objectionable to a lot of people. So it's not for us to say that it's okay. It's objectionable to a lot of people. So if they say it needs to be changed, it's it's not for me to say it's okay to have that name on the bird. And it's there's a lot of names. A lot of birds are named for people. And there's been a lot of discussion also of Audubon. Several birds are named Audubon. There's Audubon Society, and I imagine that you've probably had some of these discussions, or there was some about a year ago, quite a bit of writing about this. But Audubon owned slaves, and didn't really object to that. And you can say, yeah, that was the times. That was his. He was just doing what white people did, but that doesn't make it acceptable. And so it's a difficult thing, but it does just perpetuate the sort of white European history privilege of ornithology and science, and we want that to be open to everyone, for everyone to feel welcome in that world. And if changing the names seems like a pretty small step to make that more welcoming to everyone. So that's my.
Okay. We're getting close to having a few questions left, but I've got some more bird-oriented questions, and one from a 9-year-old listener.
Okay.
And she wonders, how do birds hear?
Yeah, they have ears, and their ears work pretty similarly to ours. But their ears are on the side of their head and just below and behind their eyes. They're completely covered by feathers, but they're covered by a smooth coat of very specialized feathers. So if you think about, if you're running really fast or riding a bike or stick your head out of a car window when you're driving along, the wind in your ears is incredibly loud and it's hard to hear anything. And birds, they're often flying 25 miles an hour, which is faster than most people ride a bike. And so having this really streamlined, smooth covering of feathers over their ears means that the air just slides by without making any noise. There's no turbulence. So when a bird is flying 25 miles an hour, it's pretty silent, and there's no wind in its ears because its ears are protected by feathers. So you don't see a bird's ears except on a bird like a turkey or a turkey vulture. that doesn't have feathers on its head, then you can see the little ear opening just where you would expect it to be, behind the eye and below. And most birds have these very lacy feathers that cover that to provide some protection and streamlining, but still allow sound to pass through.
Okay. Here's another question. You talked about feathers a little bit. And so I had a couple of people ask, what is different about cormorant feathers? So why do they get wet and not stay dry?
Yeah, there's been a lot of debate and a lot of kind of conflicting reports about that. And the question of why cormorants stand with their wings spread is still not 100% answered. The answer seems pretty obvious, that they're drying their feathers, but that's not totally confirmed. But they do have oil in their feathers, or they do have preen oil. They preen oil into their feathers just like other birds. So that's a myth that I heard a lot over the years, that cormorants lack oil in their preening, so they don't. So their feathers aren't waterproof. But I think the best answer that I came across, the best explanation, is that so they have on the feather, a typical oval feather shape on their body feathers, they have the barbules that hold the barbs in position only in the center of the feather. So there's a central part of the feather that actually is waterproof. And at the outer ends of each barb, there are no barbules. The barbs are just loose, kind of lacy and flexible. So that part can get wet. The water sticks to those barbs where there aren't any barbules. So the barbs can get pulled together and stuck in a drop of water. So when a cormorant spends more than 10 or 15 minutes in the water, its feathers start to get wet. But just the edges, just the margins of the body feathers, where there aren't the barbules, and then they have to get out and dry off. And another question about that is why that happens. Why presumably there's some advantage for them to let their feathers get wet, to let the margins of the feathers get wet. It's a pretty specialized structure of the feathers, but nobody's figured that out yet. Although it is known that the great cormorant, the North Atlantic species, is known to be the most efficient marine predator. They catch more prey per unit of time than any other marine animal that's been studied. So
Amazing.
They're incredibly efficient predators, and it's possible that letting the feathers get wet helps them in some way, either reducing buoyancy or moving more easily through the water or something. But that's still waiting to be discovered.
I have a question from an 8-year-old named Carrie.
Okay.
And let's see, what's her question? I just forgot it here. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Well, I lost it. Oh, here it is. Why do northern shovelers have such big and long beaks?
That is a good question, and it's I always say the why questions are the hardest ones to answer because a lot of times we don't really know why. But the shovelers, they use their bill mostly to filter food out of the water. So kind of the way, almost the way a baleen whale sucks in water that also hopefully has some food in it, and then they squeeze the water out through the sides of the bill where there's some like a comb-like structure that would trap food inside the bill and let the water go out through. So, and I think if you watch shovelers on the water, most of the time what you'll see them doing is swimming along with their bill almost horizontal, just kind of resting on the surface of the water and the tip of the bill in the water. And if you can see them really closely, you'll see that they're constantly doing this with their bill, just nibbling, like they're nibbling at the surface of the water, and kind of, I think they're opening their bill to pull water in and closing it to squeeze water out, and just constantly slurping. And each time they squeeze the water out, hopefully some food gets trapped against these combs on the sides of their bill. And I think that the big, wide, flat bill probably makes that all of that feeding more efficient and helps. They can pull in more water and process more. But that I don't know if anybody has actually studied that to figure out if that's really true. And when people have looked at some of these feeding behaviors and feeding adaptations like that, they found really surprising things, like the way a hummingbird's tongue works to pull nectar out of a flower. It's I describe it in the book. I won't try to go into it here, but it's just amazing how a hummingbird's tongue does not work the way you think it would work. And this was just discovered a few years ago. And lots of things like that. I think shovelers,
the number of things that people are discovering that they were just assumed. You just assume that this is the way things work, but when you actually study it carefully, that isn't really what we're finding out about birds.
Yeah, and I bet if you took a very close look at what shovelers are doing with their bills and their tongues and how they're feeding, there would be some surprising revelations in that.
Okay. Well, I have two more quick questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up here. So one question is, why do ground nesting birds nest on the ground instead of trees when it seems to be so dangerous on the ground?
Yeah, that's another why question. It's very difficult to know, but they, each species has evolved behaviors that work for them. That's the way evolution works. That the behavior, the adaptations, the ones that allow the birds to survive and raise young are the ones that persist and propagate. So ground nesting, it doesn't seem like a good idea, but at the same time, putting a nest in a tree can be really conspicuous. It's It's more protected from predators like foxes, but it's much more obvious to predators like crows and chipmunks and hawks. So there are probably equal dangers on both sides, and it's more in the details of how it's done. But you wouldn't think that nesting on the ground would be a good idea, but it works for a whole lot of species.
So my last question is relevant, especially to our area on the West Coast. And I'm not sure if this is, if you're a hummingbird expert at all, but I had a number of people wonder, is there any way to make peace with hummingbirds? Because when the males decide to be, it's when they establish their territories, no matter how many feeders you put up, they always seem to be attacking the other hummingbirds and guarding those feeders.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a feature of hummingbirds.
And especially around here in the winter, the Anna's hummingbirds, we have the Anna's hummingbirds that do nest in this, or do
Yeah.
overwinter in this area now.
Yeah, so I have a friend in California who he had a one or two hummingbird feeders on his patio, and he had a few hummingbirds visiting, and then a really rare species showed up, but it immediately got chased away by the Anna's hummingbirds. So he ran to the store and bought 6 more feeders and put them up, and he had 6 times, 10 times as many hummingbirds, but they were still chasing each other away. There was a couple of birds were dominating the feeders still. So he went and got like 10 more feeders, and that was enough. And his experience would say that if you put out enough feeders, and if you can put them around different places where they're not all visible from the same spot, so what happens is, well, you all know this, one male will sit on a prominent perch where it can see all the feeders, and it will chase all the birds away from all the feeders. But there is a point where you get enough feeders, the male, 1 or 2 males can't police all of the feeders all the time. And at least my friend's experience was that once he reached some critical number of feeders, the birds would come and feed peacefully side by side. And he did a study a few years ago where he took photographs of birds on one perch, on one feeder. He just trained a camera on that spot and photographed the birds. And then he just looked at the male Anna's hummingbirds that had come to that perch. And by variations in the pattern on their throat and other things, he was able to recognize individuals and just kind of tally a number of individuals. And he would have said that there were 30 or 40 hummingbirds total visiting his feeders. He'd see 15 at once, something like that. He ended up with, I think, over 200 different male Anna's hummingbirds that sat on that one perch over a period of a few weeks. So anyway, that's kind of a sideline to the rest, but I think try more feeders. That's my answer.
Well, David, this was so wonderful, the conversation with you and the presentation, and I love your new book. And I'm just, before I turn it over to Claire, I'm just going to put in a plug for North Cascade Audubon Society. And we have quite a few Zoom presentations going on, and I recommend that people go to the North Cascade Audubon website, and you can read all about our different events and presentations. So again, thank you, David. It was wonderful having this conversation with you. And so Claire, take it away.
Yes, thank you so much. This was, one of my favorite takeaways will be get more feeders. I'm just going to get more feeders because we have that problem in our backyard with the hummingbirds. So thank you, gentlemen, so much. And to the audience, so many wonderful questions. I know we couldn't get to all of them, and I'm sorry. I have a feeling we could be here all night long because there's a lot of interest in this audience, and we appreciate it. Again, this is the book right here. If you don't already have a copy of it, it is simply gorgeous. And you can get it from Village Books or your favorite, your local independent bookstore, wherever you happen to live. So David Allen Sibley, thank you so much. Stephen Harper, thank you so much. This was just delightful. And any last words, gentlemen?
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for all the questions and for your interest, and just stay healthy and stay curious.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, we'll say good